You know that feeling when something goes terribly wrong, and afterward, you just keep replaying it, like your brain won't let it settle, won't let you move on. Some people walk through fire and come out changed but not broken. Others carry the same fire inside them for years, maybe decades, and for the longest time, we called that difference strength or weakness, or we didn't call it anything at all because we didn't really understand it. But here's what we're starting to learn. Resilience isn't just about willpower or perspective or how many therapy sessions you can afford. It's neurochemical. And one of the main players, dopamine. I'm Esther Adams, and this is Strides to Solutions, where we take the science of the mind and translate it into something that feels less like a textbook and more like relief. Today, we're talking about why some brains bounce back after trauma and why others get stuck, not because they're failing, but because their dopamine system is telling a different story. So let's start with what dopamine actually is, because I think most of us have this vague sense that it's the feel good chemical, the one that lights up when you eat chocolate or get a text from someone you've been thinking about, and that's true. But it's also wildly incomplete. Dopamine is more like a motivational interpreter. It doesn't just make you feel good, it tells your brain what's worth paying attention to, what's rewarding, what might keep you safe, what deserves effort, and critically, what you should do next when everything feels uncertain or dangerous. When you go through something traumatic, your brain is flooded with signals: fear, confusion, a need to survive. And in those moments, dopamine doesn't disappear. It shifts, it recalibrates. And depending on how it shifts, whether it ramps up in certain areas or quiets down in others, your brain might move toward adaptation or toward getting stuck in that traumatic loop. The research we're looking at today shows that people who demonstrate resilience after trauma often have higher dopamine activity in a part of the brain called the nucleus accumbens during the stressful event itself, not after, during. And that timing matters because what that dopamine surge does is essentially increase the subjective value of the stressor. It makes the brain say, okay, this is hard, but I can do something about it. It biases you toward active coping, toward problem solving, toward agency instead of helplessness. People who don't have that dopamine response during stress, their brains are more likely to interpret the situation as insurmountable. And that interpretation, I can't do anything, becomes the foundation for susceptibility for getting stuck. Now, I want to pause here because this might sound like I'm saying resilience is just built in. Like some people have the right dopamine response and some don't, and that's that. But it's not that simple. And honestly, thank God it's not, because if it were, we'd have no hope of intervening. Dopamine systems are shaped by a lot of things. Genetics, yes, but also early life experiences, chronic stress, social support, even subtle differences in how your brain circuits are wired. One of the studies in this research looked at something called homeostatic plasticity in dopamine neurons, basically, the brain's ability to adjust its own sensitivity to dopamine over time based on what it's been through. If you faced chronic stress, your dopamine neurons might reduce their firing rate as a protective measure, kind of like turning down the volume so you're not constantly overwhelmed. But that same adjustment can also make it harder for you to feel motivated or rewarded later on, which is part of why trauma can lead to that flat, numb feeling people describe. The flip side, some brains respond to stress by increasing certain dopamine receptor expressions, essentially making themselves more responsive to reward and motivation, even under difficult circumstances. That's resilience at a cellular level. It's not about being unaffected, it's about the brain finding a way to stay engaged with life, even when life is hard. Here's where it gets even more interesting. There's this concept in the research called the rebound excitation theory. And I know that sounds technical, but stay with me because this is actually kind of beautiful. So, when something scary happens, let's say you're in a car accident or you witness something violent, your brain's fear circuits activate. The amygdala fires, your body floods with stress hormones, you go into fight or flight, and for a while, dopamine neurons actually decrease their activity during that acute fear response. They quiet down, but then, when the danger passes, those dopamine neurons don't just return to baseline. They rebound, they spike, and that rebound signal acts as an intrinsic safety cue. It's like your brain's way of saying, okay, the threat is over, you can relax now. For people with healthy dopamine rebound responses, that signal helps terminate the fear. It puts the brakes on, it allows the brain to move from danger mode back into safe mode. But if that rebound doesn't happen, or if it's too weak, the fear circuit stays partially activated. The brain never fully gets the memo that the danger has passed, and that's one of the mechanisms underlying PTSD. It's not that the person wants to keep reliving the trauma. It's that their dopamine system isn't giving them the neurochemical signal that would allow them to let it go. I think about this a lot when I work with people who describe feeling stuck. They'll say things like, I know logically that I'm safe now. I know it's over, but my body doesn't believe me. And what they're describing is exactly this: a mismatch between cognitive understanding and neurochemical signaling. Their prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for logic and reasoning, knows the threat is gone, but their amygdala is still firing because the dopamine rebound didn't do its job. The safety signal didn't arrive. And here's the thing, that's not a failure of willpower. It's not even a failure of insight. It's a failure of circuitry. And understanding that, really understanding it, can be deeply relieving for people because it means you're not broken. Your brain is doing what it was wired to do based on the signals it's receiving. The question is, how do we help it receive different signals? Okay, so we've talked about how dopamine during stress promotes resilience and how dopamine after stress helps terminate fear. But there's another layer here that I think is crucial, and it has to do with where in the brain dopamine is acting. The mesolimbic dopamine pathway, which runs from the ventral tegmental area to the nucleus accumbens, is central to reward processing and motivation. When that pathway is functioning well, you feel capable of pursuing goals, of finding meaning, of staying engaged with life even when it's difficult. But trauma can disrupt that pathway. Chronic stress can lead to what's called dopaminergic dysfunction in the nucleus accumbens. Basically, the reward system stops responding the way it should, and when that happens, everything starts to feel pointless, effortful, like you're moving through molasses. This is why people with PTSD often struggle with anhedonia, the inability to feel pleasure. It's not that they've chosen to disengage from life, it's that their dopamine system, which is supposed to signal reward and motivation, has been suppressed by the weight of unresolved stress. And here's where the research offers something really hopeful. When scientists artificially stimulate dopamine activity in the nucleus accumbens during stress, using optogenetics in animal models, they can induce resilience like behaviors. Meaning, dopamine isn't just a passive marker of resilience, it's an active driver of it, which suggests that interventions aimed at supporting dopamine function, whether through behavioral strategies, medication, or other therapies, could genuinely help people move from susceptibility toward resilience. Now, I want to talk about genetics for a minute because this is where some people start to feel a little fatalistic. Like, well, if my genes determine my dopamine response, then there's nothing I can do. But that's not quite right. Yes, genetic polymorphisms, variations in genes related to dopamine receptors, transporters, and enzymes, do influence how your dopamine system functions. Certain variants are associated with increased risk for PTSD, others seem to confer some protection. But genes don't operate in isolation. They interact with environment, with experience, with epigenetic regulation, which is just a fancy way of saying that your life experiences can actually change how your genes are expressed. For example, early life adversity can lead to epigenetic changes in dopamine pathways. Specifically, it can alter the expression of dopamine receptors in the hippocampus and prefrontal cortex, which affects how you process stress and regulate emotions later in life. But, and this is key, those changes aren't necessarily permanent. Epigenetic modifications can be reversed or modulated through new experiences, through therapy, through social connection. So while genetics matter, they're not destiny. They're more like a starting point, a context. And what you do with that context, how you care for your nervous system, how you build support, how you engage with healing, can shift the trajectory. There's another piece of this research that I find really compelling, and it has to do with the interaction between dopamine and other neurochemical systems, particularly norepinephrine. Norepinephrine is a stress hormone, but it also plays a regulatory role in the brain. And it turns out that noradrenergic input to dopamine neurons in the ventral tegmental area is crucial for maintaining resilience under chronic stress. Basically, norepinephrine helps modulate the excitability of dopamine neurons. It keeps them from becoming over or underactive. It maintains homeostasis. And when that regulation is functioning well, the dopamine system can stay responsive and adaptive, even in the face of prolonged adversity. But when noradrenergic regulation is disrupted, which can happen with chronic trauma, the dopamine system can dysregulate. And that dysregulation contributes to both the mood symptoms and the cognitive symptoms we see in PTSD and depression. This is why trauma isn't just about one brain system going haywire. It's about how multiple systems interact or fail to interact in ways that either support resilience or undermine it. Okay, so here's where I want to bring this back to something practical, because all of this neuroscience is fascinating, but the real question is, what does it mean for someone who's actually struggling? First, I think it reframes the conversation around trauma and resilience. For so long, we've talked about resilience as if it's a character trait, something you either have or you don't. But this research shows that resilience is neurobiological. It's rooted in how your dopamine system responds to stress, which is influenced by genetics, early experiences, current environment, and the quality of support you have access to. That means resilience isn't fixed. It's not something you're born with or without. It's something that can be cultivated, supported, and in some cases, restored. Second, it suggests that interventions aimed at supporting dopamine function could be genuinely protective. Now, I'm not saying everyone needs to run out and get on a dopamine agonist. That's a conversation for a prescriber, and it's not appropriate for everyone. But there are other ways to support dopaminergic health. Exercise, for example, increases dopamine receptor expression and enhances dopamine release in reward circuits. Social connection, particularly positive attuned connection, also boosts dopamine. Even behavioral activation, which is a core component of many trauma therapies, works in part by re engaging the dopamine system and helping people reconnect with sources of reward and meaning. Third, and this is the one I think is most important, it validates the experience of people who feel like their brains aren't working right after trauma because you're not imagining it. Your dopamine system has been affected, your reward circuits have been disrupted, and understanding that, having language for it, can reduce the shame that so often accompanies post traumatic symptoms. You're not weak, you're not broken. Your brain is responding to trauma in a way that made sense for survival, but that response is now keeping you stuck, and there are ways to help your brain shift out of that pattern. Before we close, I want to talk about one more finding from this research that I think is both sobering and strangely hopeful. Under conditions of extreme stress, dopamine neurons can enter what's called a dormant state. They reduce dopamine synthesis, they increase vesicular packaging. Essentially, they go quiet to protect themselves from cytotoxicity, from the damage that could occur if dopamine levels got too high in a hostile environment. It's a survival mechanism. The brain is prioritizing immediate survival over long-term function. And in the short term, that makes sense. But when dopamine neurons stay dormant for too long, it leads to some of the symptoms we associate with severe trauma: numbness, dissociation, lack of motivation. Here's the hopeful part, though: dormancy isn't death. Dormant neurons can be reactivated. They can come back online when the environment becomes safer, when stress decreases, when support increases. So, if you're someone who feels like you've been in shutdown mode for a long time, like your brain has been in hibernate, know that shutdown is protective. It kept you alive. But it doesn't have to be permanent. With the right conditions, your dopamine system can wake back up. I think what this research ultimately tells us is that resilience isn't about being untouched by trauma. It's about how your brain navigates the aftermath. And one of the key navigators is dopamine, helping you find reward, stay motivated, calm your fear, and reconnect with life. Some brains do that more easily than others, and that's not a moral failing, it's biology. But biology can be influenced, it can be supported, it can be healed. So if you're listening to this and thinking, I wish my brain had bounced back better, I want you to know that it's not too late. Your dopamine system is more plastic than you might think. And with intention, with support, with time, you can help it shift toward resilience. Thanks for being here. I'm Esther Adams, and this is Strides to Solutions. Until next time, be gentle with your nervous system. It's doing the best it can.